Warning: the Savage Nation contains adult language, adult content, psychological nudity. Listener discretion is advised. The Westwood One Podcast Network presents The Savage Nation. It's savage, uncut, unfiltered, and raw. Home of borders, language, culture. And here he is, New York Times best-selling author and National Radio Hall of Fame inductee, Michael Savage.
Is the American economy made of iron or glass about to break? When Trump stood on the House floor to give the State of the Union address, well, he said our union is strong. But is it really? Seems so, but is it? The rich are the reason they have no money or having trouble finding a job, even though it's the rich who create the jobs. They also believe the planet is in immediate peril. Immediate peril. We're all going to die immediately. The sky is going to fall. And they actually believe it. The socialists, like Occasional Cortex, got a win in New York just the other day. They drove out 25,000 jobs by threatening Amazon because of subsidies. So instead of the billions of dollars coming into New York City and New York State, they got zero. Why? Because they think subsidies of $3 billion could be spent elsewhere, even though in reality, that $3 billion isn't even there. And this one was supposed to be an economics graduate. Occasional Cortex has real meaning when you analyze that they didn't add up the big picture. But our side of reality is not hopeless either. Sure, good things are happening in the economy regarding jobs, unemployment, wages going up, a strong stock market. Continued deficit spending this year, approaching Obama-like numbers near $1 trillion, are ballooning our national debt even further. Trump cut some taxes, but the spending bill is out of control. Nothing is being done about health care spending, about Social Security. Both Social Security and Medicare are actually broke. Our ruling class is doing nothing to help us, and this must change. So, please join me in asking the question, how is this economy really doing? Is it solid like iron, or is it made of glass and about to shatter beyond repair? Are we really close to becoming another Venezuela? We're going to speak to a man who was editor-in-chief of Forbes magazine, which has followed business and economics for decades, and producer of a new PBS special, In Money We Trust, Steve Forbes.
Michael Savage, a host like no other.
Welcome, Steve Forbes. Welcome to the Savage Podcast. Glad you could be with us.
To do it. Thank you.
You know, the news today is pretty amazing. The president just declared a border emergency, which I'm sure you have an awful lot to say about. He certainly isn't the first president, nor will he be the last to declare a national emergency. We know that. $8 billion for walls coming out of the defense budget. Then we read on the Drudge Report, Mr. Forbes, spending binge worse than under Obama-Bush. I'm sure you'd like to talk about the budget deficit for a moment, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Well, I think.
So, what do you think about a $22 trillion budget and this kind of deficit?
Well, the deficit is a sign of government spending out of control. It's one thing to rack up debt when you're fighting a major war like World War II, saving civilization. Quite another because you're just printing money and just spending to a fairly well. And the key thing is what we do about it. One key thing is obviously having a vibrant economy, which is beginning to happen. And I think if a few events take place, this economy will really pick up steam. And the other is getting control on the spending side. And one way to do it with the entitlements, for example, is with Social Security. Don't mess with the benefits that people have or are going to have or people are about to go on the system. Instead, we should really look seriously at phasing in or bringing in a new system for younger people where a chunk of their payroll tax goes instead to their own personal accounts, retirement accounts, strict restrictions. And the amazing thing is, even if they just put the money in CDs, they'll have more for their retirement than they can from the current system. So as my generation goes to its ultimate reward or whatever, the Social Security situation takes care of itself. And on health care,
Mr. Forbes, you're an economist, aren't you, by training? Well, you're one of your principal strengths is the economy. Let's be clear, going back a long way and many presidents. You talk about a budget deficit, which we're living through. The binge is worse than under Obama and Bush. The spending is out of control. They're printing money. What is the true rate of inflation in your estimation?
Well, you have to take their measure of inflation with a grain of salt. I don't think it properly measures what's been happening in healthcare. Thankfully, the rapid inflation there has abated a little bit. Rapid rise in the cost of higher education and other things in life. And the way they do that is, if people start, because let's take a extreme example. Let's say prices of meat are going up, and so people buy less meat, or they go from steak to hamburger. Then they say, well, people are eating hamburger. Let's emphasize that in the index and take out the steak. Well, they went from the steak to the hamburger because the price of steak went up. So it's jiggered. So the cost.
So wait. So just for the average listener, Mr. Forbes, you're saying the government's report on the actual rate of inflation is rigged. It's not true, correct?
It's not what people face on a daily basis. No. You go to the supermarket. You go pay your tuition bills for your kids. You pay more out of pocket for health care now that companies are having these high deductible plans. And you go through the list and you find that even though your pay is going up, somehow you just can't seem to get ahead of the curve. You're on a treadmill and the treadmill seems to be winning.
You have a great magazine, which I'm going to plug because I read it. It's a very important magazine. And everyone knows Forbes, right? Everyone refers to it as almost a noun rather than a magazine. If you were to rank President Trump, and I don't want to put you in the hot seat, as a president, would you be willing to tell us, is he doing the right thing today by calling for a national emergency on the border, for example?
Well, I think you have to put that in the whole package. And I've not read his actual order, because it's going to be, as we know, challenged in the courts.
Yes.
And hopefully they've done their homework and laid out why their particular conditions justify the declaration, so that you don't get future presidents declaring we have a gun emergency and trying to take away our guns, or climate control and stuff like that. So I trust that they will have done a good job on that, because ultimately this is going to go to the Supreme Court. A federal district judge is going to put an injunction on. It'll
right.
Ninth Circuit, we know what's going to happen there. But eventually it's going to make its way to the Supreme Court, where the real judgment will be made.
That's what Trump said today. He said it'll go to the Ninth Circuit. We know what they'll do. Then it'll be rejected by an appellate court. Then it'll go to the Supreme Court, where hopefully I'll prevail. So he ran through it during the speech today. How long is that going to take, though? What, 2 years, 3 years?
2 or 3 years.
So what's the point of this whole speech about a national emergency?
Well, I think what he's trying to emphasize is that a country should control its borders.
Okay.
I think what is going to come about, even with this 55 miles, is constructed, is he's going to highlight that and say, here it is. What's your problem? And so it's going to be a campaign issue in 2020. And he's going to be able to say, let's complete the job. Let's listen to the experts. What parts of the border, this kind of structure makes sense. Some parts it makes sense, some it doesn't. And they get on with it. And what he did in the State of the Union, I think he emphasized two other issues. One is socialism, and the other is late-term abortion, which is a polite way of saying of infanticide.
Yes.
Two issues that the American people don't like. And he's going to ram that down the other side's throats. And I think he's going to do the same thing on border. What's wrong with having structure as part of a package of how you control the border? Obviously, overstaying visas and things like that have to be dealt with. But this is part of a package of making sure we know who's coming into the country.
We're speaking with Steve Forbes. Very important. economist, a man who has run Forbes magazine since the beginning, and he is the producer of a new PBS special called In Money We Trust. Mr. Forbes, I remember 1995 when Newt Gingrich, during that shutdown, was warning America about the consequences of crossing the $5 trillion debt milestone. $5 trillion. $5 trillion. Now, over 8 years after more or less GOP control of Congress and the White House, we've gone over the $22 trillion mark. The debt has been expanded more rapidly than at any time in our history. How do we stop this?
The only way you're going to stop it is by hammering home that this is a gross outcome of what happens when you have out-of-control politicians. And what gets overlooked is it's not just the national debt. You know about unfunded liabilities.
Yes.
Also, what, let's be polite, called the administrative state. You know, Congress passes between 100 to 200 laws a year. We know that from these independent agencies, they issue 3,000 to 4,000, before this president came in, 3,000 to 4,000 rules a year that have the force of federal law. And that is that's a government that is not accountable to we the people. So we've got our work ahead of cut out for us in sounding the alarm. And when a crisis comes up, one of the things that happened in 2008, 2009, why we didn't get sound money out of that disaster, is the groundwork hadn't been laid for it. That's one reason why we did this movie, In Money We Trust, is to get the discussion going so that we get back to what we had for 180 years, and that is a dollar as good as gold.
Well, you know, the budgets are out of control. For example, outlays for HHS under Republicans are up 12.5%. Outlays for the Department of Education spiked 23% under Republicans. Outlays for the Department of Commerce have doubled, and this is strange. Outlays on Homeland Security have actually been down by 30%, believe it or not, because of less disaster spending under FEMA than last year. But this spending binge has to come to an end. We all agree on that, and I don't want to hammer it. We all know that this is like taking credit cards and just running them up as though you're occasional Cortex who wants to end air travel and build railroads to Hawaii, which brings us to the crazy, crazy story of the Green New Deal that anyone with a rational mind over the age of 6 understands is insanity. Do you have any comments on this so-called Green New Deal? Because it's not just occasional Cortex pushing it. It's Bernie Sanders. It's every Democrat jumped on the bandwagon with it, Mr. Forbes. Have they all lost their minds?
The answer is yes. There's a psychosis out there. That's why I guess we invented psychiatry to things. And when you looked at that thing at the beginning, at least my initial reaction was, this must be staffers moonlighting, trying to write comedy skits for Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, but they're really. You ask the Democrats. Did you see after Occasional Cortex came out with this? She was surrounded by the Democrats. Then they all said "Me Too," including Elizabeth Warren. We know that Elizabeth Warren cannot win. Do you agree with me? She's not going to get anywhere.
No, and I was sorry they made Rob Lowe pull down his tweet about she will give Commander-in-Chief a new meaning. But anyway,
God,
stay away.
Yeah, no, that's coming back to haunt her for sure. You know, I want to go ahead on that and get off the economy for 1 minute, get off the $22 trillion in debt, the climate change insanity, the Green New Deal insanity. Who do you think is going to prevail in this huge? Everyone seems to be running for the presidency on the Democrat side. Who do you think has a real chance of beating them all in the primaries?
Well, and by golly, I think they're going to have to rent Yankee Stadium for the first debate with all the debates they're having. And, well, there was an interesting piece yesterday in the Wall Street Journal by a fellow named Dan Henninger talking about the strange appeal of Beto O'Rourke, the guy who narrowly lost to Cruz, senator from Texas.
Right.
He's apparently going to run for president, and he's got this charisma that a lot of Democrats and other people seem to like. I wouldn't rule out an exploration, even though it won't be official, of Michelle Obama.
Mm.
what she did the other night at I think it was the Grammys or something.
Mm.
And so what I think is going to emerge is the nominee will be the most anti-Trump candidate, and that's one of the things that Trump has going for him, is that the Democrats have to run somebody against him.
Well, that's interesting, but this 2 years and $35 million of Mueller's witch hunt yielded no Russia collusion, as we all suspected.
Right.
Isn't that gonna help the president in running in 2019 for 2020?
Absolutely. And I think that it's amazing. This guy Adam Schiff said 2 years ago, he had definitive proof of collusion.
Mm.
Well, that was like saying Joe McCarthy had the list, which he never seemed to produce most of the time. It's 2 years later. Why hasn't the media hammered him and say, all right, where is it? The answer is it ain't. And so if it ever gets around to issuing a report or reports, what you're going to find is that there's going to be a lot of heavy breathing, but they have nothing. And one of the things I don't understand is why the president doesn't declassify all of those FBI and other documents and show that the real scandal was what the other side was doing, trying to block him from the presidency. And we just saw the other day that FBI official fired tried to engineer a coup, 25th Amendment coup. I mean, this is crazy stuff, bad stuff. And he ought to hammer home that in this campaign.
Well, we're talking about all these different topics, and they're very important with a man who knows economics better than anyone I know, Steve Forbes. And I want to go back to the budget for a minute, as dry as that can be. At the end of the day, it's always all about money. And we know that the Republicans are spending not like drunken sailors, but like stone Republicans. And instead of looking to eliminate or cut back on spending, Republican senators actually met with Ivanka Trump the other day, I think yesterday, to see how they can create a brand new entitlement on paid family leave, a totally socialist program that they have in socialist nations in Europe. How is that even possible? Are they going to sell that as a conservative idea, paid family leave?
Well, this is where what happens when a party gets drifting is that, and this is where I think 2020 is going to be very important in clarifying these issues. If a company wants to give paid leave, or a state, or a federal government, they want to experiment with that, fine. But they've got to ask, what is it going to do to opportunities in this country? Businesses start small. Strangle them in the crib. We're not going to be the prosperous nation of the future. And that's repercussions all around the world. If America is in trouble, the world is in trouble. And like it or not, we are the lead nation of the world in terms of preserving freedom. You talk to executives in Asia, and they'll tell you behind the scenes, they want us to stand up to China. They want us to speak to Russia.
Steve, I know your time is limited. It's a very important topic, which is taxes and Trump's so-called tax plan. I live in the state of California. I'm a comparatively high earner, which I've worked towards my whole life, and I'm proud of it. As an immigrant son who started with nothing, no inheritance, washing dishes. I won't go down the sad story. It doesn't matter. It didn't mean nothing to me as a kid to work that hard. I liked it. But I'm still working because I love working. That's how I was raised. But I'm actually paying more in taxes under Donald Trump in California. We saw the other day that in New York State, all of a sudden they had a shortfall of $3 billion because of the high earners who were leaving the state. And Cuomo was shocked by that. Then he tried to change it the next day. What do you think the ramifications are going to be of this crazy punishment of people who reside in New York and California? Who wrote that? Why would they do that to us?
Well, the Republicans wrote it because they thought, hey, this is a way to get the blue states and to force them to cut their taxes. I disagreed with that. It's one thing to take away state and local deductions. Flat tax does that. But a corresponding slash in federal income tax rates. So you don't get a tax increase. You get a much more fair and efficient system. And so the GOP made a big mistake on that, and they should reduce those tax rates, because going back to 1986, we had the stab at simplification. We had two tax rates. The 50% rate was cut down to 28. There was a 15% rate. They cleaned the code of a lot of tax shelters. And you know what happened? Because rates were so that the value of the deduction went down, and the state of New York, under Mario Cuomo, father of the current governor, no conservative, cut the state income tax. Circumstances forced him to do it, and did it without punishing the residents of the state.
No, Mario Cuomo was a real Democrat, and he did what was best for the state in his mind. Of course, he was a liberal, but not a psycho. The son now is like an MSNBC spokesmouth. He doesn't even think through what he's doing, which leads us to the next, question on taxation. Do you think the Republicans will actually permit us in the state of California and those in the state of New York to once again deduct our state income tax from our federal? Do you think that is possible in the next year or so?
It's going to be tough. They should put it out on the table, cutting those tax rates with some other goodies. For example, just talking about capital gains, every time we reduce the capital gains tax, you get an immediate, and I underline the word immediate, increase in government revenues. And so why they didn't throw that in there as a way of stimulating more economic growth and getting revenue at the same time. But the Republicans should put it on the table and let the Democrats be the bad guys on that. So,
Steve, yesterday was a big story, on Amazon paying zero in taxes, even though the company doubled their income last year, I think, to $8 billion profit. Can you explain to the average listener, how does a corporation that earns $8 billion net pay no taxes, no federal? How is that possible?
Because a lot of those profits are what you might call paper profits, and they're covered by things like deducting for expenses for building warehouses and the like, which Amazon's been doing a lot of lately. But this gets, again, to the whole flat tax. By removing, you know this, but people need to be reminded of it.
No, you're right. I think you should talk about it. You proposed a flat tax when you ran for the presidency. I distinctly remember, because I was on the radio. I think I interviewed you. I think a flat tax is the most fair system in the world. So please go on.
Yeah, so you just don't start with the federal income tax code. You also have these enormous rules and regulations and decrees and federal court decisions that come out of this. If you add all of that stuff up, the whole federal tax code and the attendant rules and regulations comes to more than 10 million words and rising. And even the IRS doesn't know what's in there.
Oh, God.
You call their hotline, and when they get around to answering it, which they don't always do, a fourth or the third of the time, they give you the wrong answer, but hold you responsible for what they told you. So with a code like that, which gives immense power to Washington, which is why they love it, even though they pretend they don't, they feast off of that thing. And with that kind of complexity, and you take that overseas, you can find ways to try to get around paying tax. And it's totally unfair. The nice thing about a flat tax is you just throw the whole thing out. You can't reform it. There was a former chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, which begins the tax legislation in this country. He, a few years ago, before he retired, came up with a way to try to make the code better and fairer. And the thing ran to 1,000 pages. If you need 1,000 pages to fix something, you've got a problem. So just throw the whole thing out. Have a single rate, 15%, 17%, I had 17, and give generous exemptions for adults and for kids, so it cover basic expenses. And you can have a system where the first $52,800 of a family of four's salary is free of federal income tax.
So wait, I just want to. So let us say a flat tax were put in, and you wrote the bill, wrote the laws, you would say the first $52,000 for a family of four would not be taxed, even on a flat tax?
Yeah, yeah. You'd
Wow.
be able to keep some money for your expenses. And the nice thing is, so this way, no one can complain. You're going to hurt poor. It gets all around that. And above that, you pay 18%. 17 cents on the dollar. No tax on your savings. No death taxes. You should be allowed to leave the world unmolested.
Oh, you have touched on a raw nerve. Mr. Forbes, you have to answer this one. I've been telling my audience, and correct me if I am wrong, that our death tax or our inheritance tax is at 50%. Is that correct?
45. Yep.
45. Okay, so if a woman dies and leaves their farm worth $1 million to their child, the child may often have to sell the farm to pay the death tax. That's number one. Am I correct when I thought I researched this, that China and Russia have no such thing as an inheritance tax?
I believe that's correct. And
so we're more socialist. We're more socialist than China and Russia on a death tax.
Well, yes, it's weird and bizarre. And
this is crazy when you think about it. This is after-tax money. In other words, if I worked my whole life and I put it away in a state of $1 million, whatever it may be, I pay taxes on that money, and I want to leave it to my granddaughter. She has to pay taxes on that, even though I've already paid taxes on it. That's not punitive. That's beyond punitive. How did this happen? Well, how? It's by degree, isn't it?
And the crazy thing is, if you go, you live in California, if you go to Las Vegas, Nevada, you can take your million and blow it on, booze and drugs and prostitutes and things, and you pay, and you're allowed to do that. If you
wait, what do you mean do that? I don't. You mean if my lifetime money of $1 million, if I spent it instead?
Yeah, if you spend it instead, you pay no tax on it. However, as you point out, if you dare give it to your granddaughter, we got to take it away from you.
Well, I better get a charter jet. Better get a charter jet ready for Las Vegas in the future. I'm down low on those trips.
It punishes capital creation. You don't have savings in capital. You don't move ahead with the economy. It comes from investment. So the death tax is anti-growth. And they say, you create great fortunes and all that kind of nonsense. I guarantee you, human nature being what it is, third or fourth generation, that money is in the public domain. It disappears. Every generation has their unmet needs. So
you are right. You're right. There's an old British saying, English saying, from sandals to sandals in 3 generations. And boy, have I seen that here in San Francisco with the big Democrats on the Hill who have inherited fortunes from their father. And then the grandchildren usually, unfortunately, wind up completely dissipating the money, or worse yet, from sandals to sandals in 3 generations. Well, we've covered a lot with Steve Forbes. Before you leave us, Mr. Forbes, I know you're extremely busy. This issue of the Green New Deal, which we know is crackpot insanity, and air travel, or wreck every building in America and rebuild it, things of that nature. What effects would the climate change crowd and their so-called Green New Deal have on our economy?
It would destroy it. It would, and one of the things to keep in mind is if you want a better environment, a better quality of life, the wealthier an economy gets, the more middle class you get, the higher the quality of living.
Mm-hmm.
When you throw us back, they forget. They hate the automobile. What do we have before autos? Horses. You know what horses do? They do what all cows do. I mean, it's preposterous. You have an emergency. Do you want a horse taking your kid to the emergency room to 6 miles an hour? Or do you want...
That's funny. Well, as we know what horses do, so does occasional Cortex and her sorority over there. They do about the same thing. They want to eliminate methane gas from cows. I would think they should start with their own thinking.
Yes.
Unfortunately, Mr. Forbes, the so-called Green New Deal is being taken seriously by many uneducated or undereducated or brainwashed people. They want everything for free. That's the next generation. How are we going to... there's an old saying, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you have no heart. If you're still a liberal when you're 40, you have no mind. But we can't wait 20 years for these people to grow up, can we?
No, and I think one of the great things is as soon as you go out into the real workforce, most of them eventually get their true education. They don't get it in school. They learn more in the workforce than they do in school.
I've seen it over and over again with young people who were commies in college, believing the Pied Pipers like Bernie Sanders. And then they get their first paycheck. They look at the stub and they say, wait a minute. Wait. My salary was $500 a week. Why am I taking home $300?
Exactly.
They can't believe it. Where'd that money go? Who's taking my money? So I guess work is the only answer. And hopefully occasional Cortex will actually get a real job.
Work works. And with those who don't learn, well, you know, some of that's the diversity of the human race. Some learn, some don't. But those who don't learn doesn't mean we have to follow them. And by golly, one of the things too is when you talk about socialism, you tell a young person that they're not going to be able to choose the apps they want, create the apps they want, write their own software. They may have to get permission from the government. What do you mean? They become more capitalist when you start to show you won't be able to do the things you take for granted in life.
Well, the word capitalist is now a dirty word. So, you know, the changed word was free market, which is better. I actually think we need to create a yet newer term beyond capitalist, beyond free market, something that will appeal to the young and make them come to their senses. But I guess this has to conclude our interview given your time constraints on the Savage Podcast today. Again, Steve, thank you very much for being with us on the Savage Podcast, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future. I love your flat tax idea. Man, would I love it. I'd have a lot of extra money left over to buy a new airplane because I don't own one yet. Thank you very much, Mr. Forbes. Steve, that is.
Have a good
Savage Podcast.
The Savage Nation. It's Savage on demand.
The illegitimate left is saying that Trump is fear-mongering against poor Hispanics to get his wall. Of course, they'll look at it that way because they don't want the wall. They like the drugs, the illegals, the contraband. I know he's addressing a problem that's so overdue to be solved. But what is not considered fear-mongering by the vermin in the media is Democrats saying the world's going to end in the next 12 years unless we pass a Green New Deal. Their climate change is FDR's Great Depression. That's not fear-mongering? Rahm Emanuel said never let a good crisis go to waste. Less than occasional Cortex is following that line, as did Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He used the crisis of the Great Depression and veterans of World War I living in 10 cities in the capital because they had no work and the government would not pay their pensions. Why don't you listen to their words?
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait till I get it if I have to wait till 1945. What brought you to Washington? Want to beat the Undertaker, spend the money before the Undertaker gets it.
It's war, the greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865.
I knew something was going to happen, that they might be attacked. I'd never seen anything like it. They systematically went down the line, burned up all the tents and all the possessions of the people there.
The orders of the president must be obeyed, and the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army. In the shadow of the beautiful dome of the Capitol of the United States of America.
You heard that right. The U.S. government actually burned the camps of World War I veterans who were denied their pensions. And FDR jumped on the crisis in 1932. He used fear, and more fear to gain power no president had ever had before. Here are the words of FDR himself as he used fear to sell his New Deal. Pay close attention.
This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people. What's our campaign slogan, Sissy?
Happy days are here again.
Good, that's right. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
I stand all for by my refusal to accept as a necessary condition of our future a permanent army of unemployed.
That's right, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, and asking Congress for the instruments to meet the crisis. Broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency. These are the tactics of today's Democrat left. They are using unbridled fear to give them power over every aspect of our lives. Listen again.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Of course we can afford these investments, but we need a government that makes different choices, choices that reflect our values. Stop handing out enormous tax giveaways to rich people and giant corporations. Stop refusing to invest in our children. Stop stalling on spending money, real money, on infrastructure and clean energy and a Green New Deal.
Today is the day that we truly embark on a comprehensive agenda of economic, social, and racial justice in the United States of America. That's what this agenda is all about. Because climate change and our environmental challenges are one of the biggest existential threats to our way of life. Not just as a nation, but as a world. And in order for us to combat that threat, we must be as ambitious and innovative in our solution as possible.
Our planet is in peril. And there's a lot of people now that are blowing back on the Green New Deal. They're like, oh, it's impractical. Oh, it's too expensive. Oh, it's all of this. If we used to govern our dreams that way, we would have never gone to the moon. God, that's impractical. You see that ball in the sky? That's impractical. We are a nation that has done impossible things before. And when the planet has been in peril in the past, who came forward to save Earth from the scourge of Nazi and totalitarian regimes? We came forward. Who came forward to save the planet from, or continents from financial ruin? We came forward with the Marshall Plan.
I think it's absolutely realistic, and I frankly think we need to set our sights high. I think there were a lot of people who said that it wasn't realistic for the United States to get a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s when President Kennedy initially outlined that goal. But we did it, and I think we have to set our sights high. I have a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old. Global warming is an existential threat to the planet, and so if we don't command this country to think big about saving our nation and our world from destruction, then I don't think we're going to get close to meeting the mark.
The UN said we have 12 years before complete disaster. You talked to the representative of the Marshall Islands, and he's calling it what could amount to genocide if we allow things to go as they are. The reports aren't just, hey, it's going to get bad. The reports are people will die. Millions and millions and millions of people will die. And I think that there is an appetite among voters out there, especially Democratic voters and potentially swing voters, to say, hey, let's do something about this now because it's going to affect our future. And there's real economic damage that can happen as well. Billions of dollars in economic damage from crops to deaths to losing oceanfront homes and businesses.
Today is a big day for children that have been breathing dirty air in the South Bronx. Today is a really good day for families who have been enduring the injustices of drinking dirty water, or who have seen their living rooms being flooded in with the waves of rising sea levels. And today, I think, is a really big day for our economy, the labor movement, the social justice movement, indigenous peoples, and people all over the United States of America.
I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
That's it for today on the Savage Podcast.
Warning: the Savage Nation contains adult language, adult content, psychological nudity. Listener discretion is advised. The Westwood One Podcast Network presents The Savage Nation. It's savage, uncut, unfiltered, and raw. Home of borders, language, culture, and here he is, New York Times best-selling author and National Radio Hall of Fame inductee, Michael Savage.
Today we're going to talk about the worst massacres in world history. Now, why would I pick
I
such
feel
a
like
depressing
I'm
topic?
watching
Because the
myself.
leftists in this nation right now are making you think that this country is so terrible. This is the greatest country with the greatest peace the world has ever seen in the history of the world. That's number one. The leftists are filthy, dirty liars about this country. Stop the far left before they bring about another slaughter in this nation. So we're going to talk about the worst massacres in world history and man's inhumanity to man. I look around at the news, it's quite depressing. Democrats going after President Trump for imagined crimes, what he tweeted. Republicans going after Democrats for ridiculous plans that would break a nation. People are outraged because someone said something that was offensive to them, acting as though that was actually an atrocity. All of this means nothing. Nothing. All you have to do is look at real history. The history of man is littered with abuses, wrongs, genocides, slaughter, and massacres of whole villages. We were born as wild creatures who fought amongst ourselves for food, in tribes, in caves, killing each other for the leg of a prehistoric bison to eat. And it's very difficult to see that we've changed very much. In the old days, in the early days, prehistoric days, there was killing to take shelter away from another clan or tribe, to take women away from another tribe. And even as we got civilized, the slaughter has continued. On each continent and on every piece of land, battles were waged, people were slaughtered, populations wiped out. Why? Well, to claim a stake over other people or take over a certain area. During these times, a higher class of society ruled over a lower class, keeping them as serfs and slaves to do the bidding of the upper class or the sovereign. These same people were used as chattel to fight battles they had no stake in, only to keep the lords and princes and kings in charge. Using excuses such as land, wealth, power, religion, and even more menial things, rulers have used armies to wipe out entire populations of people, seeking that as the only means of being able to take what they wanted without fear of retribution. See, there was no media then. There was almost no conscience then. Yes, man was rarely human to his fellow man. That is until the rise of the modern Christian era. And even in the Age of Enlightenment, when men were deciding that Almighty God created us all equal. Even in the Age of Enlightenment, when men were deciding that Almighty God created us all equally, and we should have a system of government in which the people ruled and not the ruling class, horrible atrocities were still being committed around the world. It was accentuated in the 19th to 20th centuries as weapons continued to become more deadly. And the 20th century, as civilized as it may have been, also may have been the most violent our planet has ever seen. Well, now we're in the 21st century, in a relatively peaceful time. Yes, we see the unnecessary violence in the Middle East and Africa, with major world powers playing chess with the lives of innocent civilians. But the world, for the most part, is not at war. Instead, here in America, we become outraged over gender pronouns and what a wall means. This is why it's more important than ever to put things in context, to learn and recall the history of mankind. And that is what I'm going to discuss today on the Savage Podcast. Slaughter through the ages, man's inhumanity to man.
Michael Savage, a host like no other.
With talking about a terrible topic today, man's inhumanity to man. What a day to talk about being safe at home. But let me tell you something. In our age, no one should feel unsafe at home, period. You really have no reason to be frightened in a place like home, and that's been Simply Safe's mission from day one. Now, you may have seen their commercial about it during the big game this year. If you didn't, you can find it online. Simply Safe blankets your whole home with protection. Around-the-clock professional monitoring. Make sure that police are on the way when you need them. The security sensors that Simply Safe uses are very tiny. They blend in with your home. You won't even notice them. The Verge calls Simply Safe the best home security, and it's a wire-cutter top pick. As more than 3 million Simply Safe customers already know, it feels good to fear less. I want you to feel safe at home, the best safety you could ever get. Protect your home today, and you're going to get free shipping on any system that you order. Just go to simplysafe.com/Michael Savage. Will you write that down and will you contact them? Feel safe at home, simplysafe.com/Michael Savage to protect your home and family today. Once again, simplysafe.com/Michael Savage. Feel the safest you've ever felt at home today. Go to simplysafe.com/Michael Savage.
The Savage Nation. It's Savage on demand.
Today's podcast is about atrocities and mass murder, or mass murder through the ages. When I was reading a book, I picked up a kind of beautiful book on the secrets of Ireland in a bookstore over the Christmas holidays. It was one of those gorgeous pictures of the Irish countryside with a little plaster house and a wagon in the fields. And it was beautiful, the pastoral scenes of Ireland. And I'm looking through it, looking at the ruins and the castles and the beautiful countryside. And I come upon a piece called the Rock of Cashel, Tipperary. And it's a beautiful castle. And I read, each thing has a little description. So it says, rising up on a limestone outcrop beside the Dublin to Cork Road is the great stone fort of Cashel, with its 93-foot-high round tower scanning the horizon for potential attacks. From the 4th century, Cashel was the seat of the kings of Munster, and Brian Boru was crowned here in 977. In 1100, Cashel was handed over to the church, and a religious community flourished there until 1647. Now, hold on for a minute. So in 1100, this beautiful castle was given to the church, and a religious community flourished here until 1647. You know how long that is? 500 years. And then what happened? Cromwell's army laid siege to it, finally massacring its 3,000 inhabitants, all men, women, and children. So a Christian community is in this citadel for 500 years. Think about that. And Cromwell, the Englishman, who was trying to conquer or retake Ireland, takes one town after another, one castle after another. And when the castle's inhabitants and soldiers give up, Cromwell kills every man, woman, and child. So I started to read about Cromwell. I couldn't believe this. Because when I was a kid, I read about Cromwell, and I thought he was a great English hero of some kind. But England's slaughter in Ireland is something you have to know about for a couple of reasons. Because it was not atypical. It was not atypical for the English to conquer villages and kill everybody in the village or the town. And so I started to look into mass murders throughout the ages. And I realized something. Right now we think that mass murder only occurs when Muslims kill Christians, for example, in Africa. Or we think about mass murder during the Holocaust, when the Germans killed 6 million Jews and 9 million other people, mercilessly slaughtering men, women, and children. Or we think more recently about the massacre in Africa of black upon black, the Hutu versus the Tutsis and such like that. And then you realize that not every mass slaughter is based upon race. In this case, in Ireland that I was talking about, it was based upon religion, because the English were trying to crush the Catholics in Ireland and take back the land. Of course, there was an economic element to it as well. And so where does that leave us? When you realize that massacres like this of every man, woman, and child are not really atypical in human history. In fact, we're living through a lag phase right now in terms of what has been done in terms of man's inhumanity to man. It makes you really think about who man is and what a mad murderer the human the human species is compared to other animals. As my father told me when I was a little boy, man is the only animal who kills for pleasure. He told me that animals only kill because they have to eat. Of course, he wasn't 100% right. There are records now that are more complete, which show that some animals will kill just for sport. And chimpanzees have been seen doing that. But getting back to our main story of atrocities and mass murders through the ages, we have to go no further than our own American Civil War, where 600,000 men were killed for the war between the states, where you see, well, what the heck was that about? Was it always about slavery? No, it wasn't. In fact, Abraham Lincoln himself said that the Civil War was not originally about slavery and ending it. It was about economics. It was about him dominating the new thing called the Union. He invented a new concept of union, and that implied a strong centralized government and an imperial presidency. That's what Lincoln did. And that union now dominates virtually every important aspect of our life today as Americans. But he used very clever egalitarian rhetoric, which, was fought over, brought the states together. He was responsible for the war between the states, our Civil War, a conflict in which more than 600,000 Americans were killed. And for what purpose? Well, it ended slavery. Okay, that's very important. But as I said to you before, if you really read history, you'll see that Lincoln himself said that the war between the states was not about slavery originally. It was about his power madness, his desire to be a dictator in essence. And of course, it led to the most tragic event in American history, which was the war between the states. Now, don't accuse me of being in favor of slavery. I totally oppose that, as you well know. But the fact of the matter is, he himself has a public record. And the public record includes the fact that the future President Lincoln, came from a state whose racist laws discouraged blacks from crossing its borders. I don't know if you know that. Lincoln himself was not an abolitionist, nor was he particularly sympathetic with black freedmen. He came from a state whose racist laws actually discouraged blacks from crossing its borders. If Illinois was opposed to the spread of slavery, it was because the state's citizens were opposed to the spread of blacks. That is the truth, and it's a matter of public record. So what was the war between the states about? It was about power madness and the economics of the North, the Northerners, who wanted to control the economy of the South as well. And it led to a slaughter that is beyond comprehension. And so we must look as well at the atrocities and violence of the Revolutionary War. There's a book by Holger Huck. He wrote The History of Violence in the conflict between Great Britain and its rebellious colonies across the Atlantic. And it is really something you have to look at as opposed to the sanitized version of the American Revolution, which has been passed down through generations by the victorious United States. Hook paints a picture of what was in many ways not so much a revolutionary war, but a civil war, with both sides committing atrocities. And you'll have to understand how this myth plays out. I am going to read to you from a Boston Globe article by Wendy Smith on the dark violence and atrocities of the Revolutionary War. She tells us that the first chapter of this book, called Tory Hunting, begins with a grisly description of the tarring and feathering of an unpopular customs official in 1774. And this was one of the ways in which colonial vigilantes debased and defiled, humiliated and dehumanized their loyalist neighbors, Hook comments. And what happened next was persecution becoming official after the Declaration of Independence, when Congress and the states passed confiscation and banishment acts. What were they? Well, you'll see in a minute what they were. Britain responded with dissolution warfare. British warships bombarded coastal towns. Falmouth, for one, was reduced to a smoking ruin. What happened next? The British redcoats looted indiscriminately, seizing crops and property of rebels and loyalists alike. They didn't care. Plunder was often accompanied by rape. You heard me. Some British commanders instructed their men to take no prisoners. Wounded and defeated American soldiers were killed on the field. And when they were made prisoners, American soldiers suffered in conditions so terrible that mortality rates ran as high as 70%. Now remember now, we're talking about the Revolutionary War. We're reminded in this article that the looting and appalling prison conditions were consequences of the limited resources available to an army engaged in war that were thousands of miles from home in Britain. In other words, they pillaged. And while the abuse of civilians and execution of defeated soldiers were rooted in the view that colonials were traitorous rebels who were to be suppressed by any means necessary. So what happened? Well, unfortunately for the Brits, these brutal tactics gave the Americans a priceless propaganda opportunity, which they exploited relentlessly. What happened? The war had barely begun when in January of 1777, Congress appointed a committee to investigate allegations of British war crimes. Now, we are reminded that such a fact-finding mission at that time was unprecedented. And what did they find? The committee's report, which included some wrenching first-person testimonies, carried significant political and moral weight with audiences both at home and abroad, Mr. Hook states. It was part of the revolutionaries' consistent and successful strategy to depict the British as barbarous oppressors who employed excessive violence, while General George Washington and his troops scrupulously observed the accepted 18th century rules of civilized warfare. Now, Washington is seen, according to this writer Hook, as a balanced, morally principled, ruthlessly pragmatic general. Why? Because any Continental soldier that was caught looting was flogged, and Washington persistently begged Congress to maximize the deterrent by raising the number of lashes he was permitted to administer. Washington insisted that Americans treat their prisoners of war humanely, and usually they did. But apparently he did not consider Britain's Iroquois allies human beings. The book's most appalling chapter takes its title from the name the Iroquois gave Washington. They called him Town Destroyer. Under Washington's orders, the Continental Army carried out a punitive campaign that decimated the Iroquois' crops and homes with the avowed goal of the total ruin of their settlements. That's George Washington. And these scorched earth tactics employed against Native Americans raised hardly an eyebrow. But when the increasingly desperate British inflicted them on the white South, Hook writes, it alienated a war-weary population while reminding them of the purpose of their continued struggle. We learned that racism also played a role. Southerners were outraged that the British promised freedom to slaves who fought for them and used mixed-race raiding parties to attack plantations. One amazing fact epitomizes the moral messiness that Hook captures in such depths. Listen to this. Slaves owned by Washington and Thomas Jefferson were among those who fled from the British, and both men unabashedly retrieved their human property after Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. Let me repeat that. I don't think you know this. Slaves that were owned by Washington and Jefferson were among those who fled to the British, and both Washington and Jefferson